is Ginny McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Health Sciences Ministry at Loyola. It's my privilege to welcome you here today. In addition to our tremendous speakers, we have two additional facilitators whom you will also see today. Lucia Garcia, Director of Student Affairs for Parkinson School of Health Sciences and Public Health, as well as Dr. Lena Hatchett, who's an Associate Professor in the Neiswanger Institute for Bioethics at Loyola. Dr. Hatchett will also pull double duty of presenting and facilitating our conversation on bold vision and our 150-day goals at the conclusion of our time together. This event is a signature event during the sesquicentennial celebration of Loyola University Chicago. An event such as this reminds us both of our mission and the impact of Loyola, which for 150 years has called students, faculty, staff, alumni, and partners to advocate for change, to use collaboration creatively, and to address injustice both in its immediate and systemic presentations. This is what it means to be a part of the Loyola community. And the timing of this conference is important. Community violence rates have increased dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic. The struggles of the pandemic, not surprisingly, have trended along familiar lines, bringing increased burden to individuals, communities, and families who already bear a significant and heavy burden of life and of injustice. We see the demand for racial justice in and through our time in the community and in and through the work where we address the pandemic. We work for just and equitable access to resources, including access to healthcare. At the risk of further stating the obvious, this confluence of factors is the context of our conversation today, reminding us of the clear and urgent exhortation to move forward together, hopefully through renewed, deepened, and innovative collaborations that build upon all we hear today. It is the desire for and the willingness to work for change which brings us together in this group and moves us forward in shared action. Regarding schedule for today, our hope is that we will first hear from our esteemed keynote speaker, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox. We're so grateful that you were able to join us today. We will then hear from a series of presenters from across Loyola University and Loyola Medicine. We'll learn about initiatives and programs which address community violence prevention from a variety of disciplines and through collaborative practice. Finally, we will conclude by naming a bold vision and a 150-day goal for the group gathered. This will guide our ongoing collaborations and will offer a time for a bit of conversation. I'd also like to offer a warm welcome to many of you who were with us last year, including some of our presenters. It's wonderful to have you with us here today and to see that 1 year later, we're still in conversation and still in collaboration. One quick note of housekeeping, as it always happens at the beginning of a conference. Due to the virtual nature of this gathering, I would like to highlight the Loyola Stands website, which we'll drop into the chat here. You can easily access the schedule for the day, the full speaker bios. We'll use an abbreviated bio in the introduction for each speaker, but you can access more information about their ongoing work there. And then we'll post resources there after this conference. Each presenter has 10 to 15 minutes or a little less if you're a shared slot. Thanks, Lisa and Dr. Olson for that. But we will have other resources that folks will hope to access. So check back there periodically. We'll also update on our bold vision and our 150-day goal. As a note of disclosure, none of the planners for this educational activity have any relevant financial relationships to disclose with ineligible companies whose primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products used by or on patients. So that is our disclosure for today. Once again, thank you for joining us here today, and we look forward to these presentations. We'll move now into our keynote address. State's Attorney Kim Fox is the first African-American woman to lead the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. State's Attorney Fox took office on December 1st, 2016, with a vision for transforming the Cook County State's Attorney's Office into a fairer, more forward-thinking agency focused on rebuilding the public trust, promoting transparency, and being proactive in making all communities safe. As Cook County State's Attorney, Ms. Fox has undertaken substantial criminal justice reforms focused on public safety and equity. She has revamped the office's Conviction Integrity Unit, has been a leader in bond reform, has taken the lead on prioritizing resources away from low-level offenses to focus on violent crime, played a vital role in passing legislation to legalize cannabis and provide the broadest and most equitable conviction relief possible. Providing this relief is not only a critical part of righting the wrongs of the failed war on drugs that disproportionately harmed communities of color, It is also a statement of our values and commitment to justice for all. Thank you, State's Attorney Fox, for joining us here today. We will now move into our keynote address.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you, Loyola community, for having me a part of your summit this year. I'm always profoundly grateful to be able to be among our future leaders and current leaders as we tackle the issues that are facing our communities, and particularly the issue of gun violence. And so to commend all of you for pulling this together, especially during these challenging times, and recognizing the need now more than ever to gather collaboratively to address the issues that we're facing. I think it is probably been stated in every Zoom meeting, summit, conference that you've attended in the last 6 months or last 11 months. These are times unlike any other that we've seen in our lifetimes. That as we look to tackle these issues related to violence, particularly gun violence and crime, doing it in an era that is truly unprecedented and that has highlighted a lot of the structural systemic issues that we've talked about in theory for years playing out in practice in real time. The pandemic has highlighted where it is undeniable, even to those who seek to keep their heads in the sand, the institutional and structural racism that has permeated many of our institutions. In the criminal justice space, is the last institution that watches these structural failures along the way. And so this collaborative approach is incredibly important. As we talk about first responders, I often remind people that as a law enforcement agency, we're actually last responders. That when we meet people in the criminal justice system, it is often after a chalk outline has been drawn on the ground, after someone has been grieving, after we have seen the worst that can happen in a system of failures. That in this last year, when we have been grappling with the horrors of the coronavirus pandemic and the reckoning around race and justice in the criminal legal system in the wake of the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and the reconnection to our own storied history here in Cook County, and look at the disproportionality of those who are dying or not having access to vaccines or access to testing, or looking at the high increase in violent crime in those very neighborhoods where we saw in 2020 an increase in gun violence, an increase that you all are seeing every day around carjackings, an increase in the deterioration of the fabric that so many communities rely on. At the same time that we're dealing with the pandemic, at the same time where we're dealing with this increase in violence, again, we cannot lose sight of that there is an overlap in the communities that are hardest hit, and that the response to the violence that we are seeing requires us to take on, without apology and without hesitation, the systemic issues across the board. And again, it is why, for me, in the law enforcement space, it is always gratifying to see a collaboration of experts from across fields. Because I am often asked, as the state's attorney, what are you going to do about violence? And that necessarily absolves the rest of our communities to do the hard work to deal with the things that we know drive violence in our neighborhoods. Things like education, in an educational system that is funded in a way that has made neighborhoods that most need solid quality access to opportunities in education be the most underfunded. Educational disparities to see communities, Black and Brown communities in particular, lag behind others, and still asking those same students with the lack of resources to compete at the same level. It's around access to healthcare. That if we do not talk about access to healthcare, and not just in the realm of the pandemic, but in maternal health issues, where we're seeing African American women dying at higher rates during childbirth, where we see the death rates and the disparities around those who live in some of our more affluent neighborhoods, and you travel a few miles and the death rate is significantly higher for the same issues, whether that is related to high blood pressure, health or heart disease. Again, not that these communities are somehow more readily susceptible to these issues, it's the access to healthcare. Economic development. We cannot talk about violence and crime and not talk about the total disinvestment in certain communities, particularly communities of color, over the course of last several decades. And at the same time, the neighborhoods, much like the neighborhood that I grew up in, um, fundamentally changing and crime rates significantly dropping. For those of you who don't know, I say it in every speech that I give. I grew up in one of the toughest public housing projects in the country. I grew up in Cabrini Green in the 70s and 80s. At the time that I grew up in Cabrini Green, it was an exemplification of some of the worst failures of public policy that we had seen. Failures around housing policy, failures around economic investment, failures around crime and violence. At the time, I lived at 624 West Division, which was a tower right on the corner of Division and Larrabee, where the concentration of poverty was literally stacked on top of one another, and where violence rates in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s were significant. Homicides in the area in Chicago in 1989, 1990 were hovering around 1,000. And of those, we were seeing just in that concentrated area in the city, homicides by the dozens. And now, that same area, which was devoid of access to groceries, where the education system fared very different than the ones a mile north, where I ended up moving to Lincoln Park, we now see that area has fundamentally transformed and the crime rates have dropped significantly. Well, what do you mean? Public housing and the failures that we saw as a result of that shifted, and the towers were torn down, much like across the rest of the city. We saw a shift in resources that were then being put into the area of Cabrini, such that grocery stores were moving in, small businesses were coming. We saw a shift in who was moving into the neighborhoods and the housing quality, the shifts in the schools. One of the finest schools in the city of Chicago that is now a premier institution was one of the most underfunded schools back when I was a child there. They're so flush with resources in the neighborhood that I once grew up in that there is an iFly. And I don't know if those of you on this call know what an iFly is. It's an indoor skydiving place for people who want the experience jumping out of airplanes, but not wanting to get into an airplane. They go into this building that's right off of Halsted and Division to simulate falling out of a plane. That's how flushed with resources they are. And the violent crime rate in that very neighborhood where we saw the disproportionality of violence in the 70s, 80s, and 90s has plummeted. This is not an issue related to the people who were there. It is an issue related to the conditions and the investment in those communities. This is my long winded way of saying that dealing with violent crime is about dealing with the institutions and not making the assumptions about the morality of the people who live there. Because for far too often, if it was simply a matter of those people doing bad things, then we could absolve ourselves of the deep work that is required to deal with violence in our communities. The deep work of looking at our legislation and how we attack these issues and whether we are doing more harm than we are good. And so, as state's attorney, for me, it has been deeply personal to tackle these issues from the vantage point that I have in the criminal justice space, but also working collaboratively with institutions like Loyola and across sections within those institutions in healthcare, in education, in economics to talk about how we can address these problems. First and foremost, my priority has been keeping our communities safe. And in doing that, doing an examination of the work that we've done to achieve those goals. One of the things that surprises people about the work of the state's attorney's office, we are the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. in a county that is dealing with the unrelenting toll of gun violence year after year, is that 40% of our resources in the state's attorney's office, 40% of the cases, I should say, that come into our office are drug cases. Drug cases. That when we look at the biggest percentage of work that we do, it has largely been around not issues related to violent crime, but around people who are struggling with issues like substance use disorder or mental health, conditions that can be dealt with outside of the criminal justice system, that should be dealt with outside of the criminal justice system, that we have as an institution and as a society allowed to be criminalized for so long, that there's an over reliance on incarceration to deal with these systemic issues that can be dealt with in the healthcare and the mental health space. But the criminal justice system has become the dumping ground for those disinvestments and those failures in our system. So for me, tackling issues like substance use disorder means partnering with organizations outside of the criminal justice system to say, if we stopped punishing people for being sick, what is the alternative to helping people get well? What is the role of our institutions outside of the criminal justice system to treat public health issues like a public health issue? What would it mean to stop relying on law enforcement to do that? And the same thing with mental health. For often we see the duality of people who are struggling with mental health, who also are dealing with substance use disorder, and the failed belief that having people prosecuted and incarcerated is going to deal with the underlying issues. If we don't deal with the root causes, there will always be this continual loop of people coming in and out of our justice systems and our communities not being safer. If we don't deal with the root causes, that person who is struggling with substance use disorder, who will do anything and everything to provide or get the resources to sustain that, means that our communities won't be safer. They won't be safer. And that if we're going to deal with the issues related to having people have faith and trust in the system to deal with violent crime, because that's what we in the justice system should be focused on, is dealing with the drivers of violent crime. If the very people who need to believe in the system the most trust it the least, because we focus all our attention on criminalizing behaviors or criminalizing communities, and not taking seriously the history that we have seen in this county specifically around the relationship between law enforcement and community, and ask these same people to trust us, we're going to find ourselves where we've been in the last several months. So what does that mean? It means for me as a prosecutor that we have to align our positions around dealing with public health and public safety appropriately. It means focusing our attention on strategies around dealing with gun violence with our gun crime strategies unit, embedding our attorneys in the neighborhoods most impacted by violence, working collaboratively with law enforcement to deal with violent crime from the ground up, meaning we also have to instill trust with the communities that we serve. In addition, it means undoing the harms of a justice system that far too many people have lost faith in. That means pulling away from prosecution of, or pulling away from the failed effort on the war on drugs, and working with institutions to deal with substance health and mental health in community. It means righting the wrongs of the past with our conviction integrity unit and overturning those convictions that we know were ill-gotten. And for those who lived in those communities that have been impacted by it, to see and trust that we see them, hear them, and acknowledge the mistakes that we've made. It also means being transparent and using data. It means working with researchers like Loyola to examine the work that we've done to say, in fact, we are doing harm or doing good. It means taking on issues like bond reform and criminal justice reform, because we know that it is a false choice that you can have criminal justice reform or public safety. I have to tell you unequivocally, you cannot have public safety if you do not tackle criminal justice reform. You cannot have one without the other. It's not even just that there's a false choice. You cannot have public safety unless you address criminal justice reform and these underlying drivers. And so my initiatives over the next term will be to do just that, to bring in more partners, to work collaboratively on the drivers of violence, to talk about and tackle the issues that are systemic, that are uncomfortable to talk about, that are uncomfortable to address, that sometimes feel insurmountable. But what I know by looking at all the faces and looking at the agenda for today's summit and recognizing that we're doing this across disciplines as part of one large community, that that is the only way that we're going to be able to address that. And so I am honored and humbled to be able to be in partnership and collaboration with all of you. I must give my personal shout out to Professor Olson, who's on here, who's been a tremendous resource to us as we explain in numerical, statistical data ways why bond reform, for example, is not making our communities less safe, but in fact, addressing some of these root cause issues related to poverty. That I'm grateful for that community that we have with Loyola, again, across sectors, to be able to come to the table to offer solution and resource so that it is not incumbent just on the last responder, that we can, in fact, have a violence prevention strategy that meets the needs of the communities that we serve, that rights the wrongs of the past, and put us on a future that sees in every community where they are now the potential to meet their highest and best selves. So again, I congratulate you all here for convening in these difficult times, for recognizing that the time has always been now, but the urgency of now with all of these issues exposed and the real certified belief that all hands are on deck to see Loyola's leadership in this effort. And I thank you for allowing me to be a part of it. And beyond just today's remarks, but really moving into the future to incorporate all of your disciplines into a path forward for our county. So thank you.
Thank you, State's Attorney Fox, for that very impactful keynote. We're thankful to have you here today and appreciate your words. We are now going to open it up for a few minutes for questions. So I welcome you to unmute and or include your question in the chat, and I will facilitate.
State's Attorney Fox, thank you for your remarks and thank you for your partnership today and moving forward. I have a question for you. What would you, at the end of this day, we're going to talk about bold vision. If you were to state a bold vision, you could have anything, access to any resource to make one thing possible. What is the one thing you would focus on in the immediate future? And dream big. There's no resource limitation.
You know, it's not even so much a resource issue. I think some of our boldest envisioning is of things that we can stop doing, right? As opposed to like things that we can imagine doing. There's so many things that we can stop doing. Stop relying on the criminal justice, criminal legal system to deal with issues that we know that we can deal with in community. One of the things I think of, for example, there was a case that we just dismissed a couple of days ago where a mom trying to find housing for her and her 7 children were living in an abandoned apartment. And the police came and saw that she was living in an abandoned apartment and that they were using the bathtub as a toilet and there was backed up. It's awful conditions. And the mother was charged with child endangerment. That's not how our system should be used. And what happened was the community, recognizing that this mother was in need of resources, stepped in to be able to help provide for that. In the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of an economic downturn, particularly where we've seen women disproportionately impacted by job losses, that our immediate response when we saw a family in trouble was to engage the criminal justice system. And so I think when you talk about envisioning bold, it really is, let's start to do a check on what we do when we see crises, right? How can you shrink the footprint of the criminal justice system? How do you shrink the footprint? I think any discussion that I have around what the future should look like is an engagement in a system that is only there by necessity and not by convenience. And I know that there's been a lot of conversation around the phrase defund police and what does it mean? And the reimagining for me is about how do we use our resources to deal with the things that we know drive people into the system, and do that and stop doing all the other stuff that causes harm. Recognize the harm that some interventions cause, the long-term harm of that phone call, the long-term harm of that engagement, and ask yourself, can we do something different? And so I know that doesn't feel very bold. This system is so dysfunctional right now by all of the things that we have become accustomed to doing, that the boldness would be if we were okay with stopping. If we were okay with just saying, I'm not going to use this system to deal with this issue, and I'm going to hold people to account. There's so much accountability that we need to put on legislators, on community, to deal with and provide for the resources that we know prevent crime. I'm a responder to crime. We have to invest in crime prevention. And that means imagining resources outside of the criminal legal system to do that. And stop leaning on the criminal legal system for all of our societal failures.
We have a question in the chat that I'd like to bring up. What criminal justice success in another state gives you hope?
Criminal justice success always feels fleeting, because you'll have success and then you'll have a time like now where violent crime is on the rise, not just here, but across the country. And there will be this instinct to go back and say, aha, it is because we stopped doing the thing. So some of the successes, for example, in California around drug cases, around lower level felony cases where they bump down to a misdemeanor. In Illinois, for example, drug cases are, take marijuana out of the equation, are class 4 felonies. And what we know is that someone who gets a felony conviction is far less likely to be able to get a job, to be able to get housing, to be able to get education support by way of scholarships, that the path that people who have felony convictions go on lead them to be in this continual loop. And so seeing other places say, hey, we should not attach felonies to people who have drug convictions or make those felonies are inspiring. At the same time, a couple years later, as we see crime rates tick up, there is then this whiplash that says that we've gone too far. And so it's this weird thing about this pendulum. You hear about the pendulum a lot in criminal justice, oh, we've gone too far to fix the thing that we know is horribly broken. We would just want to fix just a little at a time. And I think the boldness of this is that we can't just talk incremental, we have to talk about large swaths. So Oregon, for example, has just decriminalized drugs, not just marijuana, harder drugs that make people, their chests, palpitate. But the reality is in 2020, we saw more opioid deaths in Cook County than we have seen, I think ever. I think it was a record number of opioid deaths. Sorry, a kid is coming home and my alarm is on. I am safe, don't worry about it. Hold on one second. You gotta love Zoom. But the reality is that we have so many people who are addicted to opioids, who are dying from opioid overdoses, and our response has to be proportionate in recognizing that need. And so places like Oregon, who are saying we need to invest in drug treatment rather than incarceration, give me hope. Obviously, the New Jersey bail reform efforts from years ago that we've modeled a lot of the work here in Illinois, eliminating cash bail, is also something that I'm very inspired by and that we have used here in Illinois to fashion bail reform laws in the state level.
Thank you. And I'll take one more question. Michelle, you had your hand up and I'd like to let you ask that question. It's a good one.
Thank you so much. Good morning, State's Attorney Fox and everyone. I am Director of Student and Family Services for Proviso Township High School District 209, and I firmly believe that investments made in education are fundamental and foundational to really solving the problem, because I believe it's definitely the root cause. And so I'm wondering, I know we have evidence-based funding in Illinois. However, we still are very, very well underfunded. I'm wondering, in your conversations with lawmakers about like adequately, and not just adequately, but like well-funding education have like come away with in terms of what the next steps are.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to, and one of the things that I've tried to do with my platform is tie it all together, right? Again, as the last responder, I should be in the conversations around education and education funding when we see, for example, if we look at the data of the young people who are getting caught up in the criminal justice system and look at the fact that, you know, a significant number of the young people that I saw when I was an assistant state's attorney in delinquency had IEPs, had individualized education plans for those not in the education space, which basically means that they had special educational needs, so what we would call special ed. And that for many of them, their needs were not being met in their individual schools because of the resourcing issue. And so if I'm able to say to you, listen, you we've got these kids who have these needs where the funding mechanisms that we have right now don't provide for their needs to be met on an educational level. And what we then see that translated into, when their educational needs are being met, many of these kids leave school, they drop out. And you can, again, correlate seeing the number of kids who end up in the adult system who have dropped out of school, who had these IEPs, and say there's a line here, there's a through line here. And that your response to crime, I'm seeing it right now related to carjackings, and young people is like, oh, it's almost eerily reminiscent of the super predator language of 2 decades ago, that we were so easily lulled into, that it is the failures of these children and their parents and not the institutions, where if you've got a 13-year-old who's out there with a gun and we don't recognize that that child was in somebody's school, where there was an educator who may have seen that there's something happening in the home, that perhaps there are all of these things that we can tune into as educators to be able to identify the needs of that child, and only respond with higher penalties, we're failing. And so for me, it has been, in my conversations with legislators around criminal justice issues, pushing the issue of education. I talk about the fact I left Cabrini when I was in 3rd grade and went a mile north to Lincoln Park, went to LaSalle Language Academy. It may have well been in a completely different place. The educational resources that we had at LaSalle, because we were a neighborhood school in Lincoln Park, was vastly different than the kids that we left behind in Cabrini. And the outcomes were dramatically different. Now, this is anecdotal, but I can look at some of my peers who I grew up with who did not have the access to the same education that I had, whether it was the ability to learn a foreign language starting in 3rd grade all the way out, the ability to learn about classical music and the like. It was really access to that that I think was a huge difference maker for me, and not a failure on the kids in the neighborhoods that didn't have those resources. And that is why, we have to have those tough conversations, because it becomes about, oh, those kids, their parents aren't teaching them, their parents aren't giving them. And it's like, no, the funding mechanisms where we can see a flat out disparity in how resources are allocated to school districts and the outcomes that they have measured across others who have greater investments and their outcomes. That disparity, to me, is a civil rights issue. That is not those kids can't learn. That is a failure of these institutions. And so I think for me, using my platform to be able to make the through line to criminal justice when people are scared gives me leeway. I want to say I'm optimistic that legislators get it. I think when we talk about equity, it necessarily means that there's going to be someone who feels that you're taking something from me to provide for others. But we have to start recognizing that, we are only as strong as our weakest school district. That we're only at the highest potential of the weakest place that we have. And I say that as the first Black woman state's attorney. If you'd have told my mother that it would have been me coming from 624 West Division, people would hardly believe it. And so I imagine the talent that we are leaving behind in school districts or neighborhoods across the city. The cure for COVID is probably in North Lawndale. But we're not investing. And until we can see that we are just as invested in those school districts and it's not mine, we're going to continue to have these disparities. And I think they will continue to play themselves out again throughout the systems and ultimately in the justice system.
Thank you so much, State's Attorney Fox, for your words, for your vision, for all that you have done and all that you are going to do. We look forward to seeing how everything continues to play out and to be partners with you in that to the extent that we are able and able to collaborate with you. So thank you for sharing your time with us. We are going to take about a 5-minute break here. We'll come back at 9:45 to carry forward.
Thank you.
Again,
Have a great
thank you.
conference, everyone.